Writing a series is so rewarding and so much fun. It's also hands down one of the best ways to build a career and a loyal readership and income as an indie author. However, it's much more complicated than writing standalone novels, and there's not as many resources out there that teach you how to plan and get ready for writing a series. So that's what we're going to talk about here today is how do you plan for NaNoWriMo or any time of year when you are writing a series. So let's get started. So we are here in my witchy writing room where everything is a little bit spooky-fied because I will be celebrating coming up in the next few weeks a spooktacular celebration, which is a yearly celebration in my fan group for the birthday of my first book, Beautiful Demons, that came out in 2010. So this will be the 12-year anniversary. We start on Wednesday. If you want to come join us, there will be over $1,000 in prizes and daily like Twitch streams and just all kinds of stuff. So come join us if you want. That's over at sarracannon.com. And basically when I first started that very first book, Beautiful Demons, I knew that I wanted to write a series, but when I went looking for all my precious craft books, there really were not a lot of resources about how to plan and write a series. How much do you need to have planned ahead of time? Does it have to be consistent? Does it have to be something that I know every single detail of the whole series before I can start writing? And what I learned was those types of resources just didn't exist. And there are some that have come on the market since then, but there's still a real lack when it comes to series planning. And so I wanted to address, if you are doing NaNoWriMo, since we're in the midst of Preptober, or you're getting ready to write a book that is part of a series, what are some of the things that you might want to take into consideration that are different than if you were planning a standalone? So there are kind of two situations that you might find yourself in. You're either writing book one of a series where you're making all those decisions about what type of a series, what is the world, what are the characters, what's the genre, and you're building those foundations. Or you might be later in a series where the foundation is set and there are some past events, and now you're trying to figure out how to weave this next book or how to decide what's going to happen in this next book and how does it fit into the rest of the series. So we're going to touch on each of these scenarios today. If it's your first book in a series, you're going to basically take all of the information that you can get out of craft books or previous videos or stuff here on YouTube, and you can apply that to that first book, but you want to apply it with a vision outward, a long-term view of, okay, so here's the foundation, but how does that carry on? And you want to already be thinking about how is this going to affect book two or book three and so on. So some of those decisions are going to look like, what type of series are you writing? Are you writing a dynamic series where it has to be read in order and it's really one large overarching story that unfolds over multiple volumes? Or are you writing a standalone series where each book is completely self-contained, but is a series connected by something that gives them that connection, like a group of friends or a Navy SEAL team or a detective following all these different cases, or maybe romances, something like that. So once you decide what type of series you're writing, you need to also think about what genre, and the genre can help you decide what type, because there are, like in romance, you're usually looking at standalone series. In mysteries, a lot of times you're looking at standalone series, but in fantasy, for example, you're often looking at that more dynamic series. So figuring out what genre you're writing and what type of series can be super important. With that being said, I also wanted to say that if you're making those decisions about world building and characters and government and rules of your magic system and what are the different, story arcs and story threads and stuff like that, I do have a series of videos here on YouTube about how to plan and write a series. And of course, as I do, it comes with a free workbook. And this is an almost 30-page workbook that has a lot of questions in here and things to consider about creating maps or thinking about what type of series, and it explains those different kinds of series. So I'm going to link all that for you down below. So if you're on my newsletter list, just go to the HB Resource Library. You got a link to it as a reminder in Thursday's video that I sent out this past week, and find the thing called How to Plan and Write a Series. If you're not on my newsletter list, you can join at the link below and you get access to all of those different resources. There's more than a dozen in there, so come and get it. So because I go over a lot of those foundational decisions in that video series, I'm not going to go as deep into it right now. So one of the most common questions that I get in terms of writing a series is, how much do I have to have planned out ahead of time? Well, the truth is there are no rules. Just like we've talked about throughout this Preptober series, every writer is an individual and your process is going to be individual to you. When I first started writing Beautiful Demons, I thought it was going to be a trilogy and I planned for it as such. But then by the time you get to book 3, I had already gotten so many ideas for how much the world is going to expand, and I learned so much more. So by the end of book 4, they're in a totally different realm, basically portal fantasy. And then by the end of book 10, the whole world is so much bigger than I ever could have imagined with book 1. And it has worked out and it has been successful. Do I think that a little bit more pre-planning of how big the world was going to get and just how big this villain was going to get would have helped me? Absolutely. But it still worked out. And I do think for me that if I had sat down 10, 12 years ago and said, oh, this is what's going to happen in book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, book 5, and had tried to plan it all out, by book 3, I would have been so far off what I had planned that all of that pre-planning would have been wasted time. So it's partially, again, just like I've said over and over, about figuring out your own personal preference and your own personal process. Some writers are going to do much better if they have things planned and they can write just directly to that plan. And some people are just going to do better if they discover the story as they go. However, there are some things for continuity's sake and decisions that you can make up front that are going to help you in this foundational stage. One of those is going to be, who is my ideal reader? Who am I writing for, and what kind of book are they hoping to get? What are they hoping to feel every time they pick up a book in this series? Because one of the big mistakes that I see people make is they think about this first book and then they go to write the second book and it's going to have a totally different tone. And then the third book, again, kind of goes off the rails. So let's say you're writing a romance series and you haven't decided, like, who's my ideal reader and what type of emotions am I trying to make them feel throughout this series? You might say, okay, the first book is going to be this really fun, lighthearted, comical, like romance where I'm going to really make people laugh. There's going to be a lot of like meet cute and lighthearted fun, kind of stuff. But then in book 2, you want to go into some really heavy, deep stuff, and your heroine has a lot of trauma and you've got people crying and you're pulling them through all these emotions. And then book 3, you want to bring a witch into the story. So now you've got magic and you've got mayhem and you've got a villain and now we've got action. Well, that's like 3 completely separate series. And I'm not saying that you can't do that, because you really can do whatever you want to do as a writer. However, when you think about your ideal reader, most people pick up a series because they know that this series has a core emotion or a core experience that it's going to bring them through. And so, for example, with my Shadow Demon saga, people pick up these books knowing that they're going to get found family, they're going to get connection, and they're going to get action, magic, page-turning twists. So if they were to pick up book 12 and it doesn't have those elements and it doesn't make them feel the same way the previous books were, it's going to be disappointing to them. So you think about your romance reader or your mystery reader. If you have book 1 is a gory, harsh, noir type book, you want book 2 to have that same kind of feel, because people are going to be learning that this is your style. This is the type of character this person is. And so having that consistency pre-planned can be super important for you. It can also be helpful to know just how big your world is going to get. So with your romance series, is most of this series going to be just set in this small town? Then you can really focus and concentrate on that town and the relationships and everything else. But if you know that your heroine is going to start out in this town, but then she's going to go to New York, and then most of the subsequent books are going to be set in the big city, then it's going to have a very different tone to the overarching series than just that first start of the first book, right? Kind of planning forward a little bit of that can help It can also be super helpful to know what's going to happen next in terms of what other characters or what other conflicts am I going to bring into the series. So going back to the romance example, you can have your main couple in book one, you can set up the foundation and the town and everything else, but you also want to know who's my next couple and my next one, to be planting those seeds, because when people are reading book one, the best way to get them to want to read book two is to introduce them to at least the hero or heroine of book two, so that they can be like, oh, I loved that pharmacist. She was so sweet. I definitely want to read her story, right? And maybe you even want to be setting up a hero that's troubled and is, part of the town's leader that's going to go through this like big character transformation. And he's finally going to get his happy ever after in book four. You might want to introduce him already in book one as this harsh, complicated character, and then you start to see a little bit of why he's changing in book two. Maybe his daughter dies and now that starts to change him, so that you get given that character some time and the readers have that anticipation of, I cannot wait for his story. And that can really build things up. If you're writing, let's say, a Navy SEAL team, you would want to introduce the whole team in book one, so that way you're kind of pre-planning what's going to happen in subsequent books, right? So that type of pre-planning can be helpful, but I don't feel that you need to plan every detail in order to be successful. The second scenario that you might find yourself in is you might be deeper into a series. So you're not coming into NaNoWriMo working on book one, you're working on book four or book five. Well, in this situation, hopefully you have less decisions to make and it's going to be a little bit easier because your foundation is already set. The genre, the tone, all of that has already been decided. And everything that has happened previously in your series is truth with a capital T. It's unchangeable. Now you can always come up with creative storylines to kind of say, oh, this was a lie the whole time or whatever, or he's not really dead. You can always pull those things back in. But for the most part, if this character had this kind of magic, or they had this kind of struggle, or this couple got together in this previous book, that couple still has that history in a future book. So one of the first things that I do when I'm planning a later book in the series is I go through and I look at two things: story threads and character arcs. Story threads is where I basically will read back through all the other books, or I'll skim back through them, and I will think about what are pieces of the storylines that I've been weaving through this whole series so far that still have unanswered questions or don't have closure yet. Let me give you an example of what I mean by a story thread. So Harper in my Shadow Demon saga, when she first arrives in Peachville, she is a foster child. And we know that she had an adoptive mother and father when she was younger, that there was an incident with a fire, and she's been moving from foster home to foster home since then. But we don't know who her real parents are. In that first book, we open a story thread of not only who is Harper's real mother, but we find out who her mother is. And now we have a question of what really happened to Harper's mother. In book two, we learn a little bit more about Harper's mother. And then in book three, we learn even more. And we start to find out that full thread of what happened to Harper's mother. There is also a story thread about Harper's father, because in book two, we start to understand who he is. And then in book five, we learn exactly who he is. And book six, we get to know more about the story. So these are story threads that may have just a little tiny piece in one book, and then a larger role in the next book, and then a larger role in the next book. And throughout a long series, you're usually going to have story threads that open, questions that open, and you're going to have story threads that get tied off with a bow, that it's like, okay, now we know what happened to her mother. That story thread is over. And now we're opening up a new thread about her father. There could also be a story thread weaving through about who one of your characters is secretly in love with. And so you have little bits and clues, or you have little bits of moments between them until finally, 5 books down the road, they finally get together and confess how much they love each other. So those are the types of things I'm talking about with story threads. They can also be mysteries woven throughout your series. They can also be events. So let's say you're writing a romance series where part of the storyline in book 1 is that the heroine has returned to town to renovate an inn that her mother used to have that her grandmother has left to her. So the renovation of the inn could be a story thread that carries through to the second book, because maybe the painter who's coming to work on painting the exterior is our next hero. And then in book 3, we have somebody coming to town to review it for a magazine. So that thread might carry through multiple places. So one of the first things that I do when I'm planning my book is I start to look backwards. So I'm not even thinking about the book I'm currently writing yet. I just look back to however many books I've already written in the series. And I start thinking about what questions are left unanswered, what events are still going on, what conflict is still here between relationships, but also with the main overarching story. And I pull all those story threads onto paper. Now, if you know me and you've been around for a while, you know that I love to color code things, especially different characters. So you could color code those story threads just using a plain marker. You could just make a dot and say, okay, all of the story threads that have to do with Harper are going to be in red, and all of the story threads that have to do with the town of Peachville itself are going to be in blue, and anything having to do with the magic system or the shadow world is going to be in green. And you can just start making a list of all of those different story threads. And then when you start planning this next book in your series, you have a list of all the things that you want to continue on, or you might want to touch on, so that people remember in this next book and it's not a dropped story thread. The other thing I do when I'm looking back at what's already been written is I make a list of all my characters. And I'm not just talking about my point of view characters, which, by the way, this video was originally going to be also about multiple POV characters, but I knew it was going to be, once I started recording, too long. So we'll have a future video about that. And I will link below some of my planning videos about multiple POV if you were looking forward to that today. Just know we're coming back to it. But if you are writing multiple POV, I'm not just talking about revisiting and making a list of those characters. I'm talking about making a list of every single character who has appeared in your series thus far that is going to carry on or have some kind of impact on this book and future books. What I will like to do, again, I color code my main series characters, and then secondary characters I'll just put in black or something like regular size pen. Regular colors of pen. But I will even pull up those very minor characters if they're going to play a role. Harper's going to go into this shop. The shop owner is there. Now, hopefully you've done some work to already put together a series Bible or a wiki or something like that where you have a lot of these characters already listed out. But if you don't, take some time to go back through, just skim through your previous books and make a list of those characters. Then what you're going to do is you're going to list out, where did we last leave this character? So some of this is going to relate to your story threads, and you can weave those together. And some of it will just be like, oh yeah, okay, so Marianne is off with Leah. And last time we saw her, she was wearing this bracelet that Essex's mom gave her, and she had just cut her hair and dyed it blonde. That is not actually what happens in my series, so don't get shocked if you're reading it like, what did I miss? But you have those kinds of things so that you have that continuity of remembering where you left your characters and you pick up right where you left off. It's also helpful to put any notes in there about what that character has been through or what their current emotional state is, or for your main POV character or characters, what is the character arcs that they have already been through? Because this is another pet peeve of a lot of readers is like, let's say you have this one main heroine that is overarching for the entire series, just the one heroine. People don't want to see heroines go through a character arc and overcome something only to butt right back up against it in the next book. So if your character has already overcome a certain trauma and she's unlocked her magic, let's say, and she's had that fight to unlock her magic and get over the past, you don't want to open up book 4 and now see that she's back to can't cast magic again. Like, we've been there. We don't want to have to go through that transformation all over again. We want to build on the transformations that have come before. So with your previous main POV character or characters, you want to really look at what have they overcome? How have they grown? So that you can meet them in this next book where they are currently and start building on that. Because we don't want the character to just be recycling old character arcs. You want them to have new character arcs in each one. And these are some of the main things, like I said, I look at when I'm looking at the truth of the series, what has come before and how that's going to affect this current series. Another thing I do in this planning phase for a new book in a series, though, is I also think forward. So unless I'm writing the very last book in the series, which I'm currently going to be doing, and it's hard, so hard, y'all. I'm also looking forward. So what comes next? What else am I going to be setting up in this book that needs to play into the larger character arc or story arc or overarching villain or whatever? So like my example with romance, what characters are coming up next? Do I need to bring some new characters into town? Do I need to really have some kind of scenes here with the doctor because he's going to be the hero of the next book? So you're thinking ahead, not just what's happening in this book, but where does it where does it fit into the whole series in terms of what came before and what's coming next? And when it comes to like a dynamic series, you want to take those story threads and you want to think about how am I going to weave them through the current book that I'm writing? And not just that, but am I going to close out that story thread in this particular book? Or is it going to continue to weave forward? So let's take this story thread with Harper's mother. So in the beginning, we know that she knows nothing about her mother, but then in that first book, she does learn a little bit about her mother and who she used to be, and she even sees a picture of her. But that's not the end of the story, right? In book 2, I weave that thread in just a little bit. But when I'm sitting there trying to plan book 2, I need to make a decision of, is this the book where we find out what really happened to Harper's mother, or is it going to happen in the next book? So this is really a process, like I talked about, like my brain ping pongs. This is a process of looking at what's past and looking at what's coming up, and then thinking about what's the main story arc of this, what's the main action that's going to happen in this particular book. So you can take that list of story threads, those lists of characters, and you can start thinking, what's the main action in this story, and which of these story threads are relevant, and do I want to close them out and answer those questions once and for all, finish them out, tie them off with a bow, or are they going to continue on? And if they're going to continue on, what does that trajectory look like? And this is hard work, but it's so necessary to really give the reader a consistent story where you're coming back to these things that matter. So when I start to actually plan the current book, I've already done those lists that I was talking about. And that's when I start to look at, okay, what's the plot of this book? And usually the opening first act, instead of that, like into the new world and stuff like that, when you're planning a series, especially a dynamic series, you're looking at how are my characters reacting to the end of the previous book. So for my type of series, I always end on some kind of cliffhanger or preview, like a zinger of what's coming next. And so there's always some sort of reaction in the next book as to what happened and how I left them. So that is part of what comes in, and that's where I start weaving those story threads in. So think about that reaction and then start thinking about, where does this book need to end to become a piece of that larger picture, right? And hopefully that will help you get started on your series planning. So again, go download this How to Plan Your Series. Hopefully you can get started on your story threads, and we will talk more about multiple POV in an upcoming video. So coming up this Thursday, we're going to have what I hope is going to be a really cool video, which is how to plan your life and how to prep your life for NaNoWriMo on the non-writing side of things. Like, what do you tell your family? How do you get them on board? How do you set your space up, your clothes, your meal plan? How do you create time for your writing? How do you manage the emotional and mental health side of it is coming up later this month as well. And I'm looking forward to these videos. If you have been enjoying the Preptober videos, please sign up for my newsletter and grab that Preptober planner. Subscribe to this channel, tell your friends about it. One of the best things that you can do is to share it with other writers and say, hey, I found this really great set of videos. That's super, super helpful to me. And make sure you like this video and comment down below. All right, you guys, if you're watching this on Sunday, it's our final day of the virtual writing retreat for October. I have been telling people we are maybe potentially planning a in-person writing retreat coming up in next year, 2023. So I hope you'll put that on your radar and start thinking about it for when we announce some dates, and just lots of fun stuff coming up. I love you guys. Thank you for being here and being part of this community, and I will see you in Thursday's video. Bye.